afternoon, my friends. This is Paul. I know I try to keep a consistent filming angle when I'm making these, but I thought I would like to be semi-consistent this time because I was watching some of my old video game reviews, the ones back before I had a fancy schmancy capture card device. And a lot of the angles that I used for those reviews were honestly kind of cool. Like, in a lot of them, I sat back from the camera, but yet because my voice was so close to the computer, I was still able to hear myself really well. And I also think that was a bit of a flattering shot, too, because I really liked how I looked in some of those. And so I thought, if you guys really like this angle, then that might be an avenue of potential semi-change. Obviously, I'm an ISTJ. How often do we really like to evolve and change? But I'd like to think by my standards, I've evolved quite a lot, just in my own way. Which is a perfect segue into the title of this video. Because I was watching the collab that Isabel's Psychology Life Hacks and I did, where we took the Myers-Briggs test from each other's perspective. And one particular phrase that kept standing out to me while I was listening to her responses was, he cares in his own way. He would show sympathy in his own way. Now, maybe it didn't pop out that many times in the grand picture. I guess it just seemed like it was more just because that was so... It was really understandable. Like, I felt like not a whole lot of people would have grasped that kind of concept. They would have instead taken the ultimatum black and white approach of either the ISTJ cares or the ISTJ doesn't care. Whereas she seemed to accept that because we're tertiary feelers and not inferior feelers, there is going to be a smidgen of subjective emotion and some kind of caring, even if it's not particularly well developed in noticing the emotions of others, but that can be a topic for another video. The point is, because ISTJs are tertiary feelers, it means that compared to the feeling types where if they see, say, a dog, they'd be like, oh my gosh, a puppy, that's so cute. Or when they hear good news, they might say something like, oh, congratulations on having that baby. Oh, I'm so proud of you. ISTJs don't find that very natural. Now, admittedly, in my case, I can do that when it's something that's familiar to me or it reminds me of something that changed my life. Like if I were to see one of my mission trip buddies again, I probably would squeal like one of those feeling types to be like, oh my gosh, guys. Oh my gosh, you do realize you changed my life. Of course, if I were to run into them spontaneously and not like be able to plan it out, it might be a lot more of just like, oh my gosh, you realize that I'm still alive because of you. So it would be a little bit more stilted, a little bit more downplaying the actual emotion. But I wouldn't say that I'm lying about how I feel. I just present it in a more subdued manner. Now, I don't think this is necessarily based on any fears or preconceptions. Like, for example, the ESTJs having inferior introverted feeling, they're actually afraid of their own emotions and consider it weak. Whereas with me, I'm not necessarily afraid of them, but sometimes I think expressing them fully would lead to miscommunications. And because I have inferior extroverted intuition, I hate miscommunications. So that's something I want to avoid at all costs. I want to make sure that not only am I hearing things clearly, but so is everyone else. So if people have to say, I'm sorry, but could you please rephrase that? That's honestly kind of a bit of a triggering phrase for me because I really like clarity and precision. And so if I'm not being precise, that means I'm not doing a good job. So regarding the whole in your own way thing, I definitely think that because ISTJs prefer their routine and they prefer the glory of the familiar, that also leads to them wanting a unique way to express themselves based on that familiarity. So an ISTJ that, say, grows up in a family that's super touchy-feely and affectionate would probably be a lot more willing to like give long hugs to a friend. Whereas there are plenty of ISTJs I know that don't like hugs at all. They're just like, don't touch me unless you're my family. But there are some ISTJs that say, I love hugs, just don't spring them on me. So I think a lot of how we express ourselves is going to be subjective and personal. So this video isn't meant to be a definitive, this is how ISTJs do things that feeling types do more naturally. More so, I want to get across the point that in our case, it's important to remember that introverted sensing and introverted feeling are two functions apart. And when you forget about the extroverted thinking in the middle, that can lead to what's called a dominant tertiary loop, or if you want to be really particular, an SIFI loop. Now, every type has loops, but what's really cool about looping is that each type that has the same first letter but different second through fourth letters all share the same loop. So in the ISTJ's case, they share the loop with the INFP because INFPs have dominant introverted feeling and tertiary introverted sensing. So when we get into those mindsets, we have a tendency to overanalyze our past hurts and like try to find a routine where that doesn't happen again. So I guess you could also say that when an ISTJ is hurt, that also impacts how they express their emotions, because I guess you could say that's one avenue that would actually get an ISTJ to get out of the rut and try something new, is if they've been hurt or if they've been devastated, then they'll realize that was a mistake. Things need to change. Unlike a lot of the dominant intuitive types where they change for its own sake, more so the extroverted intuitives, but I've seen some dominant introverted intuitives say stuff like, oh, Paul, do we have to walk the same path again? So I would say that if you really want a more generalized, more objective way of saying, well, just tell us right now, Paul, stop dancing around in circles and just tell us, how do ISTJs care in their own way? Well, I think the most efficient way for me to explain this would be to talk about the secondary function, which it's so ironic that it's my secondary function, but yet I don't mention it as much as the other ones. It's so weird. But extroverted thinking is the function that governs how an ISTJ is able to get to, or how the ISTJ is able to make something happen after thinking about it. So after the ISTJ says, you know what? I think it would be really great if I was able to remember all of the great things in my life. Then the extroverted thinking would try to come up with a realistic, practical way to make that happen. Like they'd say, okay, then we're going to go to the dollar store and invest on the cheapest calendar. Or if they're even more of a penny pincher, which ISTJs tend to be very stingy about their money, they might even say, okay, let's gather up some of these spare notebooks and put them to use by writing down the most important dates. Spoiler alert, that's actually how I've developed such a good memory, is by writing things down, and now I've gotten to the point where I don't really need that all that much anymore. So, by that logic, then, how an ISTJ goes about expressing themselves is going to be based on something that's a lot more pragmatic, instead of being very subjective. Because a lot of times when people express emotions, it's oftentimes not a very realistic response. Like, sure, stuff like when you have tear ducts and you're not actively saying, I am going to cry, I am telling my brain to cry, but the reason they're crying is, of course, subjective. They'll be like, oh my gosh, this scene is so touching. Whereas I think an ISTJ, when they want to show care, they'd like to think of something that actually makes sense and is not just something made up. Like, for example, they could say, okay, well, I'm pretty sure no one wants to go through life without toilet paper, so I'll buy toilet paper for my friend who doesn't have their driver's license because it would be inconvenient for them to walk all the way to the dollar store by themselves, especially in this miserable heat, because then they could have heat stroke or sunburn. So the ISTJ is thinking about the realistic surroundings. And they're also thinking about making sure that there's not miscommunication so that their intentions aren't misunderstood. And so they downplay their emotions for the sake of making sure that it's realistic, and also for the sake of making sure that they don't veer too far away from their own experiences. A little bit of a teaser for a future video could potentially be, what would happen if an ISTJ steered away from the glory of the familiar? The short answer I can give for that is nothing. We'd probably just stand there looking stupid and be like, what do I do? So that could definitely get us in some really amusing situations. But generally speaking, if you want me to boil this down to one or two sentences, when ISTJs care, they're not going to be all... They're not going to be like this shirt where they're throwing out the hearts and saying, I love you, I care about you. Instead, a lot of it is going to be taking place in the background, or in the case of a lot of my really close friends, I'll usually tell them after the fact, like, I tried so hard during this hangout to make sure that I didn't cross any lines, or I'll say, you do realize that extroverted feeling is my polar function, so it's very hard for me to comprehend when someone else is feeling an emotion, but know that I am trying. So, even if they are able to express it, it usually takes them some time. So I would advise that if you have an ISTJ in your life that you feel is a bit emotionally constipated or seeming like they're not caring about you and coming across as more rude and distant, I would take a step back and think, maybe the ISTJ is just doing it in his or her own way. And maybe if you just outright ask the ISTJ, like, what is your way of caring? I don't think they would consider that an offensive question. And I don't think they would tell you a lie either. Unlike a lot of people where if you ask, how are you? And they just automatically say, fine, because they're so used to that question they don't even think about it. That's a pretty uncommon question for ISTJs. So that would prompt them to not give an automatic response. So if you say something like, so I was wondering, what is your way of showing love to a loved one? Then they would probably be willing to explain it. They might not get all super duper bubbly and detailed about it, but they'll probably give you a general answer. Like they'll say, well, if I wanted to please my husband/wife, I would wash the dishes for them. Or they'd say, I would buy her a box of chocolates, because the love language is different between every type. So it's possible that there's an ISTJ that has physical affection all the way up. Those are probably the ones that end up sleeping with their partners before marriage, but that's a different story because ISTJs and religion aren't necessarily go hand in hand. But to wrap up this particular topic, I just want to say that I think you guys should give us a lot more credit. Most of you on this channel already have. You guys have been really wonderful in understanding how caring I actually am and how much I really do try to please you all. Just, it's not always going to be the most smooth transition. So thank you very much for putting up with me, and I hope you'll show similar levels of patience to other ISTJs that are even less developed in their tertiary function than me, because man, those ISTJs, they can be a piece of work. But for the most part, I think we're a lot better than people give us credit for. I also think sometimes we want to be the most underrated type, but that's another discussion. Gotta love tangents. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, my friends. Let me know if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or critiques in the comment section. And until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, God bless, and forgive me in advance if I kept topic jumping so much. Bye!